We're watching something extraordinary unfold right now, something that fundamentally changes the calculus of this conflict. Putin just declared that Russian forces hold the strategic initiative across the entire front line. And more critically, he's warning that Moscow will expand its buffer security zone along the border if peace talks collapse. This isn't posturing, this is a declared strategic shift. What makes this moment particularly significant is the convergence of three critical factors happening simultaneously. First, Russian forces captured Kurakov in late December and are now advancing in multiple directions across eastern Ukraine. We're talking about Russia gaining 232 square miles just in the past month, territorial gains we haven't seen at this scale since the early days of the invasion. Second, Putin has now officially announced that the Orishnik intermediate range ballistic missile system will enter combat duty this month, a weapons platform he claims is impossible to intercept. And third, Washington's entire strategic posture is in flux with the transition between administrations. Here's what the establishment won't tell you openly. Putin stated clearly at his recent press conference that Russia would prefer to achieve its objectives through diplomatic means, but then immediately followed that with a hardline ultimatum: complete Ukrainian withdrawal from Donetsk and Luhansk regions, abandonment of NATO membership aspirations. This is the negotiating position from a position of perceived strength. Meanwhile, Ukraine is responding with everything it has. Ukrainian drones struck an oil depot in Russia's Smolensk region, causing fuel spills and fires, and Ukrainian forces are conducting operations against Russian positions even as Russian advances continue. The deeper question nobody in Washington wants to address is this: what happens when the immovable object of Ukraine's territorial integrity meets the unstoppable force of Russia's declared red lines? We're not just watching a military conflict anymore. We're watching the architecture of the post-Cold War order being dismantled in real time, with both sides convinced they're defending existential interests. And that's precisely what makes this moment so dangerous and so consequential for everyone. Let me walk you through what's really happening here, because the media isn't connecting the dots in a way that reveals the actual strategic picture. What we're witnessing is a carefully orchestrated sequence of military and diplomatic moves that tell us far more about where this conflict is heading than any official statement from Washington or Moscow ever could. And I want you to understand this not as isolated incidents, but as part of a coherent strategy that's been developing over the past several weeks. The Orishnik missile deployment represents something fundamentally different from what we've seen before in this conflict. When Putin stood on Russian television in late November and announced that Russia had successfully tested this intermediate range ballistic missile against Dnipro, he wasn't just showing off new hardware. He was sending a very specific message about Russia's willingness to escalate vertically in response to horizontal escalation by the West. Think about the timing here. Ukraine had just begun using ATACMS missiles to strike targets deep inside Russian territory on November 19th, followed by Storm Shadow missiles hitting Kursk region on November 20th. Within 48 hours, Russia responded with a weapon system that travels at Mach 10 or 11, carries multiple independently targetable warheads, and according to Putin himself, cannot be intercepted by any existing air defense system. The Pentagon confirmed this was the first combat use of an intermediate-range ballistic missile since the Cold War era treaty banning them collapsed in 2019. Now, here's what Washington doesn't want to discuss openly. When US intelligence assessed in early December that Russia might deploy Orishnik again within days, they characterized it publicly as intimidation rather than a battlefield game changer. But that assessment misses the entire strategic dimension of what's happening. The Russian state media immediately began broadcasting flight times to European capitals: 20 minutes to London and Paris, 15 minutes to Berlin, 12 minutes to Warsaw, 17 minutes to NATO headquarters in Brussels. This wasn't random propaganda. This was Russia explicitly placing European decision-making centers within its targeting envelope and doing so in a way that makes interception mathematically impossible with current technology. The message to European governments is crystal clear. If you continue facilitating Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory with your weapons systems, your own capitals are now directly at risk from weapons you cannot defend against. But it gets more complex when you examine what Russia has actually deployed versus what they're threatening. US officials acknowledged that Russia only possesses a handful of these Orishnik missiles and that their warheads are actually smaller than the conventional missiles Russia has been regularly launching at Ukraine throughout the war. So, why the massive propaganda campaign around a weapon system that exists in very limited numbers? Because the Orishnik isn't primarily a tactical weapon, it's a strategic signaling device. Russia took what appears to be a modified RS-26 Rubezh intercontinental ballistic missile, reconfigured it as an intermediate range system, and used it to demonstrate that they have crossed a threshold. The threshold isn't just technological capability. It's the willingness to deploy nuclear-capable delivery systems in a conventional role, deliberately blurring the line between conventional and nuclear warfare in a way that creates maximum ambiguity for NATO decision makers. And this is where the timing of Putin's recent announcements becomes absolutely critical. On December 18th, just yesterday, Belarusian President Lukashenko announced that Oreshnik missiles are now stationed in Belarus, not being prepared for deployment, not scheduled for future delivery, already there on Belarusian soil. This places these weapons even closer to NATO's eastern flank, cutting flight times to Warsaw and Berlin even further. Putin had previously stated that while Russia would control the missiles, Belarus would be allowed to select targets. Think about what that means strategically. Russia has effectively extended its intermediate range strike capability westward by several hundred kilometers while maintaining deniability through a proxy relationship with Minsk. This is straight out of the Cold War playbook, except now it's being executed with weapon systems that move far faster than anything that existed during that era. Now, let's talk about what's happening on the actual battlefield, because this is where theory meets reality and where Russia's strategic positioning becomes either validated or exposed. Putin declared at his marathon year-end press conference that Russian forces hold the initiative across the entire front line, and the data supports this claim in a way that should concern anyone paying attention. In November alone, Russia captured over 600 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. That's the largest monthly gain since March 2022, when Russian forces were advancing on Kyiv in the war's opening phase. In December, Russian forces took control of Kharkov, a strategically important town in eastern Ukraine, and have been systematically capturing settlements in the Donetsk region at an accelerating pace. The Ukrainian Deep State Monitoring Group shows Russia now controls approximately 116,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory, representing roughly 19% of Ukraine's landmass. That's an area roughly equivalent to the state of Ohio. The human cost of these Russian advances tells its own story. November saw the highest Russian casualties since the war began, with estimates suggesting Russia is losing over 1,000 soldiers per day in brutal human wave attacks designed to overwhelm Ukrainian defensive positions through sheer numerical superiority. But here's what the casualty figures don't capture. Russia isn't running out of manpower. Putin announced that Russian forces have grown to 1.5 million personnel, with over 1,000 volunteers signing military contracts every single day. Whether these are genuine volunteers or men pressured into service through economic incentives and social pressure is almost beside the point. The relevant fact is that Russia has found a sustainable model for force generation that allows it to absorb catastrophic losses while continuing offensive operations. Ukraine, with a much smaller population and increasingly strained mobilization capacity, faces a fundamentally different calculus. Ukrainian President Zelensky disclosed in December that Ukraine has lost 43,000 soldiers killed since the invasion began, with 370,000 wounded. These numbers are almost certainly understated, but even taking them at face value, they represent an enormous burden for a country with Ukraine's demographic profile. And here's the asymmetry that matters. Ukraine cannot trade casualties with Russia at anything approaching an equal rate and hope to prevail. The mathematics of attrition warfare favor the larger force, especially when that larger force has demonstrated willingness to accept losses that would be politically unsustainable in Western democracies. Russia lost an estimated 600,000 killed or wounded in 2024, according to various intelligence assessments, yet continued not just fighting, but advancing. That tells you everything about the Russian leadership's tolerance for casualties and their confidence that they can outlast Ukraine in a war of attrition. Meanwhile, Ukraine's strategic gamble in Kursk region is revealing its limitations. When Ukrainian forces launched their surprise incursion into Russian territory in August, seizing over 24 settlements, including the strategically important town of Sudzha, Western analysts celebrated it as a significant military and political success. The operation was audacious, well executed, and caught Russian forces completely off guard. It was also supposed to serve as leverage for future negotiations, allowing Ukraine to trade Russian territory for Russian-occupied Ukrainian territory in any eventual peace settlement. But that leverage is eroding rapidly. Ukrainian military sources now acknowledge that Ukraine has lost over 40% of the territory it initially captured in Kursk, with Russian forces supported by North Korean troops steadily clawing back settlements on the edges of the Ukrainian-held salient. More importantly, the Kursk operation required Ukraine to divert significant combat power away from the Donbass, where Russia has exploited Ukrainian weakness to make its largest territorial gains in over 2 years. This brings us to the diplomatic dimension, and this is where the story gets really interesting because we're watching the entire architecture of potential peace negotiations being constructed in real time, and it's not being constructed on terms favorable to Ukraine. The Trump administration has launched an intensive diplomatic push to end the war, proposing what officials describe as a 28-point peace framework. The details of this framework that have emerged publicly are stunning in their implications. According to multiple reports, the plan would require Ukraine to cede de facto control of Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts to Russia, without Ukraine being required to formally acknowledge the loss. Russia would gain control of these territories, Crimea would be recognized as Russian, and in exchange, Ukraine would receive security guarantees short of NATO membership and access to approximately $200 billion in reconstruction funding, half from unfrozen Russian assets and half from European contributions. Ukraine would also be required to swear off NATO membership permanently and hold elections within 100 days. The plan calls for NATO to agree not to deploy troops to Ukraine and for Russia to agree not to invade neighboring countries, though what enforcement mechanism would make such promises credible is entirely unclear. Most significantly, the plan was reportedly not primarily authored by the United States, according to Secretary of State Marco Rubio's comments to senators, but rather drafted in consultation with Russian officials. Senator Mike Rounds described it on a call as basically a Russian wish list. Former US ambassador to Russia characterized the reported terms as a really bad deal for Ukrainian, European, and American national interests. And yet, this is the framework that's being actively negotiated in capitals across Europe and in meetings in Geneva, Abu Dhabi, and Miami. Ukrainian Defense Council Secretary Rustem Umerov announced that Ukraine has agreed to the core terms of the peace proposal following discussions in Geneva, though he noted some details remain to be worked out. That phrasing itself is revealing. Ukraine hasn't agreed to a comprehensive peace deal. They've agreed to core terms, which means the fundamental framework that requires them to surrender territory in exchange for promises of security guarantees and reconstruction funding. The tough issues that still need to be worked through almost certainly involve the specific details of those security guarantees, the timeline for implementation, and perhaps most critically, what happens if Russia violates the agreement and launches another offensive in 5 or 10 years. Because let's be honest about what this deal represents. It's a recognition that Ukraine cannot militarily reclaim the territories Russia currently occupies, and that continued fighting will only result in Ukraine losing more territory, more people, and more infrastructure, while the international community's willingness to provide unlimited support continues to erode. Putin, for his part, has signaled that he views this framework as a possible basis for negotiations, but he's also been crystal clear about his maximalist demands. At his year-end press conference, he stated that fighting would only stop when Ukrainian troops withdraw from territories they currently hold in Donbass, and that if they don't withdraw voluntarily, Russia will achieve this by force. He also called into question the legitimacy of Zelensky's government, arguing that presidential elections should have been held in 2024 but were postponed due to martial law. This is classic Russian negotiating strategy. Establish a maximalist position, force the other side to negotiate from a position of weakness, and then claim any agreement that falls short of complete capitulation represents reasonable compromise. The reality is that Russia believes it's winning and sees no reason to make substantial concessions when time appears to be on their side. Now, here's where American domestic politics enters the equation in a way that fundamentally shapes the strategic landscape. President Trump has made ending this war a priority, describing it as part of his active efforts even before taking office. He met with Zelensky and Macron in Paris in early December, sent his special envoy Steve Witkoff to Moscow to meet with Putin, and has been personally involved in the details of the proposed peace framework. Trump's team has set aggressive deadlines, initially pushing for an agreement by Thanksgiving, then Christmas, though those deadlines have proven unrealistic. The urgency from the Trump administration isn't primarily humanitarian, though that element certainly exists. It's strategic and political. Trump campaigned on ending America's involvement in foreign conflicts and stopping what he called the endless flow of American treasure to Ukraine. Every month this war continues represents a political liability for an administration that promised to resolve it within 24 hours. But here's the trap that nobody in Washington wants to acknowledge. Trump's desire to declare victory and withdraw from active involvement in Ukraine creates leverage for Putin, not for Ukraine. When one party to a negotiation desperately wants a deal more than the other party does, guess which party dictates the terms? Putin knows that Trump's political timeline requires an agreement, and that Trump will face immense pressure to accept whatever terms Russia offers as long as they can be packaged as a reasonable compromise that ends the fighting. This dynamic explains why the proposed peace framework looks so favorable to Russian interests. It's not that American negotiators are naive about Russian intentions. It's that they're operating under political constraints that require them to accept a deal that Putin is willing to sign, rather than holding out for terms that would actually secure Ukraine's long-term sovereignty and territorial integrity. European leaders find themselves in an impossible position. They publicly express support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. They've provided nearly $200 billion in assistance since the invasion began. Many European capitals have accepted hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian refugees and restructured their defense industries to provide weapons systems to Kiev. But they're also watching the United States, their primary security guarantor, negotiate a peace deal without meaningful European input that would require Ukraine to surrender territory to an aggressive neighbor. The European response has been to promise robust security guarantees for whatever remains of Ukraine after the agreement is signed, including potentially deploying European peacekeeping forces to Ukraine to monitor any ceasefire. But these promises ring hollow without American backing, and Russia has already indicated it will not accept NATO country troops on Ukrainian soil. So, what exactly are these European security guarantees worth if Russia decides to violate them in 5 years? The answer, unfortunately, is not much. Meanwhile, Russia has been systematically targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure throughout the fall and winter of 2024, destroying approximately 90% of Ukraine's thermal power generation capacity and 40% of its hydropower installations. Ukraine now operates at roughly one-third of its pre-invasion electricity generation capacity heading into winter. This isn't random destruction. This is a deliberate strategy to make Ukraine ungovernable, to create conditions where Ukrainian citizens face freezing temperatures without power, and to increase pressure on Zelensky to accept whatever terms are offered at the negotiating table. The message to the Ukrainian population is stark. Continued resistance means more suffering, more destruction, and more winters without heat or light. Surrender means reconstruction funding and at least the possibility of normalcy, even if it comes at the cost of giving up territories that most Ukrainians have never visited. The nuclear dimension of this crisis continues to simmer beneath every conversation about escalation. Putin revised Russia's nuclear doctrine in November, lowering the threshold for nuclear weapons use to include responses to conventional attacks on Russia supported by nuclear powers. This revision was clearly aimed at the United States and Britain, whose long-range weapons Ukraine was using to strike Russian territory. Putin then deployed tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus and signed a mutual security agreement with Lukashenko that explicitly includes the possibility of nuclear weapons use to defend the Union state. None of this means Russia intends to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine or NATO. What it means is that Russia is deliberately manipulating the nuclear threat to create maximum psychological pressure on Western decision makers and to raise the perceived costs of continued support for Ukraine. Every Western intelligence assessment about Russian nuclear posture has to account for the possibility, however remote, that Putin might actually follow through on these threats if he perceives Russia's territorial integrity or regime survival to be at stake. The North Korean dimension adds another layer of complexity that has received insufficient attention. Russia has deployed an estimated 11,000 North Korean troops to Kursk region to help reclaim territory captured by Ukraine, marking the first time North Korean forces have engaged in combat outside the Korean peninsula since the Korean War. This isn't just about manpower, though the additional troops certainly help Russia's efforts to dislodge Ukrainian forces from Kursk. It represents a broader realignment of authoritarian powers, with Russia, North Korea, and to some extent China and Iran forming an increasingly cohesive bloc willing to provide each other material support in confronting Western influence. North Korea is getting Russian missile technology, nuclear submarine design assistance, and economic support in exchange for artillery shells, troops, and diplomatic backing. This is the kind of alliance structure that reshapes global power dynamics over decades, not just the duration of this particular conflict. China's role remains ambiguous, which is perhaps the most interesting element. Beijing continues to position itself as neutral, calling for negotiations while refusing to condemn Russia's invasion. Chinese companies continue doing business with Russia, helping Moscow evade sanctions and maintain access to critical technologies and components. But China has not provided direct military support to Russia in any way that Western intelligence can verify, and Chinese leaders have been carefully avoiding actions that would trigger secondary sanctions from Washington. Why? Because China is watching how this plays out as a test case for their own potential moves against Taiwan. If Russia can successfully annex 20% of a neighboring country's territory through military force, absorb catastrophic international sanctions, and eventually negotiate a peace deal that legitimizes its territorial gains, what lesson does that teach Beijing about the costs and benefits of forcibly reunifying Taiwan? Conversely, if Russia ends up militarily exhausted, economically devastated, and internationally isolated, even after achieving tactical victories, that suggests the costs might outweigh the benefits. The broader implications for the international order are staggering, and this is what keeps serious strategists up at night. If this war ends with Russia retaining significant Ukrainian territory and the international community essentially accepting this as the price of peace, what precedent does that set for every other territorial dispute worldwide? Does it tell China that seizing Taiwan is acceptable if you're willing to endure a few years of sanctions? Does it tell regional powers that might makes right and that international law only applies to countries too weak to ignore it? Or conversely, if the United States and Europe double down on support for Ukraine and this conflict drags on for another 5 years, does that drain Western resources and attention away from other strategic priorities like deterring China in the Indo Pacific? There are no good options here, only least bad alternatives, and reasonable people disagree vehemently about which alternative is actually least bad. What we're witnessing right now is the collision of several irreconcilable realities. Ukraine cannot militarily defeat Russia without substantially more support than Western nations appear willing to provide. Russia cannot achieve complete victory over Ukraine without casualties and costs that may eventually exceed even Putin's tolerance. The United States wants out of this conflict for both political and strategic reasons. Europe wants Ukraine to survive as a sovereign nation, but lacks the military capability to ensure that outcome without American backing. China is watching carefully and drawing conclusions about American resolve. And millions of Ukrainians and Russians are living through the consequences of decisions made in distant capitals by leaders who will never experience the direct costs of the policies they're implementing. Putin's recent statements make his strategic calculation clear. He believes that time is on Russia's side, that his military is gaining ground, that his domestic economy can sustain the war effort despite sanctions, and that Western support for Ukraine will inevitably erode as electorates grow tired of funding a seemingly endless conflict. More importantly, he believes that Russia has more at stake in Ukraine than the United States or Europe do, and that superior will and resolve will eventually prevail over superior resources and technology. History suggests he might be right about that calculation, at least in the medium term. The United States has far more firepower than it had in Vietnam or Afghanistan, but it lost both of those conflicts because the opposing forces cared more about the outcome than Washington did. The question is whether Ukraine represents a similar dynamic or whether the proximity of the conflict to NATO territory and the implications for European security create a fundamentally different strategic equation. The Orishnik missile in this context is both a weapon and a symbol. As a weapon, it's a limited production system that carries smaller warheads than other missiles Russia already possesses and exists primarily to demonstrate technological capability rather than to achieve significant battlefield effects. As a symbol, it represents Russia's determination to escalate in response to Western escalation, its willingness to blur the line between conventional and nuclear warfare, and its confidence that it can intimidate European decision makers into restraining their support for Ukraine.